Greetings and welcome back to everyone. My spouse enjoys watching me perform these things. I'm Rosa, and I would want to share a very special and heartwarming story with you today. Poignant tale. This is a path I never thought I would take, yet it has now turned into an integral aspect of my life. The narrative explores the fine lines between loyalty, camaraderie, and surprising feelings that cause me to wonder if in this story, I am moving in the right direction, yet I am torn between two tough decisions. Devotion to my spouse and a strong bond with a lifelong buddy. What starts out as casual interactions eventually escalates into intense feelings I can't ignore. Will I have the courage to confront them? Or will I stick with my life partner and take the safe route? Every event I have makes me doubt limits, love, and trust. If you're interested in where this emotional journey takes me, I sincerely hope you like this video and follow my channel. Your encouragement motivates me to develop and share more authentic experiences, feelings, and tales with you. Gracias. Okay, let's go back to my narrative. It started out as a brief moment, so innocent enough that I didn't give it much thought, but now that I'm looking back, I can observe how I was perilously near a line that I never thought I would ever approach. The most peculiar aspect of my husband, I initially believed it was because he not only noticed but also encouraged it. As things progressed, it became apparent that it was either a test or a light-hearted joke. That beyond the surface, there's something much more intricate and profound. This man, who I'll call Adrian, has been a part of my life for a long time. He's the kind of family friend who simply and magnetically energizes a space without even trying. Acknowledge the underlying current that has always existed between us, but I've always dismissed it as innocuous after I'm happily married. But Adrian began making subtle remarks after that. He would comment, "You're radiant today," but disarmingly intimate. He held my look for a little too long, where I wish my girlfriend valued my I initially laughed it off, assuming it was just his natural sense of humor. Light-hearted manner, but my husband Lucas saw that his response was anything but. Instead of being obnoxious or irritated, Lucas was delighted and nearly with a playful smirk, he declined Adrian's offer. Has excellent taste, and his remarks stayed with me, making me wonder what he genuinely meant. That one evening, while we were tidying up after a dinner party, I couldn't help but giggle at something my husband Lucas spoke, yet there was a tinge of interest, perhaps even excitement, in his voice that stayed with me for a long time after that, and that's where it all started. Began as playful taunting, but it evolved into something far more complex. Lucas started to support me in tiny, nearly undetectable ways, recommending that I sit a little bit closer to Adrian or dress up a little more when he's there to laugh a little more at his jokes. It initially seemed like a harmless game to play during those late-night talks, but gradually another evening, Lucas suggested something, and the distinction between light-hearted and something else started to get hazy. Unexpectedly, "Why don't you accompany Adrian to get the groceries for the barbecue? It will be faster without me," he added in a casual tone, but there was something in his eyes. I was left wondering about everything because of something deeper that I couldn't quite place. Was this just Lucas expressing faith in our union, or was there more going on here? Then the vehicle journey arrived. A brief but significant moment with Adrian. Everything was cool in the evening, but the mood inside the automobile was tense. After all, Adrian was a man, and there was an unexplainable tension. I had undoubtedly shared innumerable memories and giggles with Lucas or others. This was no exception. The drive began without incident and was full of small conversation on the snack and barbecue alternatives. However, as we arrived at the store's parking lot, Adrian turned to face me, his smile growing softer as he said, "You've been recently." He spoke in a low voice, yet I hesitated for a moment, uncertain. How can I reply differently? "What do you mean?" I asked in a light-hearted manner. "I don't know," but he shrugged and held my gaze for a beat too long. "Happy, freer, whatever it is, you look wonderful in it." I chuckled uneasily. Before I could stop it, the sound escaped, and I hastily exited the vehicle, dismissing his remarks as light-hearted banter. However, something within aroused a mixture of flattery and discomfort. Was it inappropriate for me to feel as though I was being observed in a different way in the store? Tried to concentrate, but his words kept repeating in my head, and Adrian remained too close at one point, gradually eroding the barriers I had thought were unbreakable. He didn't immediately draw away as we both reached for a bag of chips, and even though it was a desperate situation, this particular moment stuck with me because it felt heavier than it should have. As we went through the checkout and returned to Adrian changed the subject in the car on the way home, speaking in a light-hearted, but with that exchange, Lucas looked at me and said, "Deliberate. Lucas is a lucky guy." Lucas grinned, "Not all husbands would be so laid back about you and me hanging out." I questioned, "What do you mean?" as a knot grew in my gut. My voice was light, but my chest constricted, and he paused as though he was picking his words carefully. "I mean, some guys might get envious, but Lucas doesn't mind. It's refreshing." The word refreshing lingered in the air, its meaning circling around in my head. Was there something more going on here, or was Lucas really as indifferent as Adrian thought? Lucas was waiting on the porch, but we couldn't see him when we turned into the driveway. With the same inquisitive expression in his eyes and a beer in hand, "How was the trip?" inquired in a casual tone, but his eyes darted between Adrian and me as though he was attempting to. "It was okay," I murmured, hurrying past him to interpret an invisible code. I was about to enter, but I could sense the anxiety in their eyes. That night, as we lay in bed, the air crackled like static, and I was unable to hold. I hesitantly started my voice, "I can't do it any longer. Can I ask you a question that is hardly audible?" Turned to face me, his tone was obviously calm but attentive. Steadily comforting me, I inhaled deeply, mustered the bravery, and asked, "Why did you want me to go with you?" "Only today, Adrian." Lucas grinned slowly and thoughtfully. "I trust you," he whispered softly, with a smile that gave me an unanticipated chill. I briefly trusted him because of his voice, which carried a weight that was both comforting and disconcerting. I felt a wave of relief come over me, but before I could release my breath, he added something that genuinely stopped me cold, "And I believe it's beneficial for you." Long after he shouted those words, they continued to replay in my head. What was that intended to mean? To imply that I was unable to get rid of the suspicion that Lucas wasn't giving me everything, but I wasn't prepared to press him just yet. But over the course of the following few days, life appeared to return. Lucas continued his regular routine as usual, or at least pretended to. I couldn't ignore the shift, even though nothing had changed, and all of a sudden I was being extremely conscious of everything Adrian said or did while he was around. Made me feel as though I were viewing him from a different angle, which made every look and statement feel intense. One evening, we entertained another group with an energy I couldn't quite put my finger on. As usual, Adrian and his friends are having a casual supper at our place. Arrived late, and as soon as he entered, I sensed once more that Lucas noticed the same unquestionable energy that I had been making a concerted effort to ignore. Adrian Lucas also yelled and gestured for him to come closer. Grinning, "You must try the ribs, they're her greatest," but his purposeful focus on her caused a collision that lasted till the evening, sending heat racing to my cheeks. Unfolded, I noticed Adrian stealing looks at me repeatedly. At one point, I forced myself to turn away as my stomach constricted, and I went to get a bottle of wine in the kitchen, thankful for some alone time, but before Adrian seemed to be able to unwind, leaning comfortably against the counter. He spoke in a low, playful voice, ignoring me, and I laughed uneasily, concentrating on "I'm not avoiding you, don't be," as I uncorked the wine bottle. Nevertheless, he moved closer, his voice becoming softer and more solemn. I eventually looked up, and I could see how intense his eyes were. "You can talk to me about anything, right?" For a little moment, searching prevented me from continuing to pretend. I answered hurriedly, turning aside, "I forgot how to breathe, nothing's bothering me." But before he could press, I knew he could know because my heart was racing. "There you are," Lucas murmured as he continued to walk in his time, which was almost too perfect. Although his eyes were anything but, his tone was light, and everything seemed well here. Naturally, I forced a smile in response, but Lucas could also feel the tension. Lucas and I remained together on the couch later that night after everyone had left, the quiet between us thick and unspoken. I could sense his keen, expectant gaze on me, as if he broke the silence between you and Adrian while he waited for me to speak, and he started his "You're close, aren't you?" I hesitated, my voice, calm but purposeful. I said, "We're friends," as my heart quickened. Why did he shrug his gaze, never leaving? I find it fascinating how he looks at you and how you look at him. What does that mean? Lucas grinned, but it didn't reach my gut. His eyes, so perhaps you ought to investigate it. What happened? His countenance stayed fixed as I glanced at him in shock. Are you serious? All I'm trying to say is that life is too short to ignore your emotions. Alive, I couldn't speak. Was he trying to test me, or was this a trap of some sort? After this, I knew that nothing would be the same, and the days that followed felt like a tide RPP over an invisible chasm. Every time Adrian and I looked at one another, it was tinged with Lucas's remarks, reflected an underlying agreement that neither of them dared to name. Persistently reminding me that life is too short to disregard the emotions you experience alive. It wasn't really a casual comment, rather, it was an invitation to what I put myself in a rut, holding on to the normal tasks, preparing for the grill, but despite my best efforts to divert myself, I thought of Adrian that night because of the way he looked at me, as if he could see aspects of me that I was unaware of. Existing, his presence evoked in me an unidentified, visceral, and unquestionably, Lucas and I went to a friend's wedding the following weekend. Extravagant party where everyone was supposed to behave well, but rather than making my Adrian felt more tense and vulnerable because of the incident. Naturally, he was charming as always, moving across the room with ease and making everyone laugh, but the tension between us was evident every time our eyes met, and I couldn't stop seeing how he moved as his voice grew softer as he spoke to me, and at one point I became so overcome that I excused myself. Before I could even gather myself, Adrian went to the area to get a drink. Was at my side, reassuring and disarming. You, all right? He asked in a quieter voice than I, nodded through my pulse as usual, laced with something I couldn't quite place. Deceived me, I'm just exhausted, it's been a long time. After a long day, he flashed that sly smile that always made my heart skip a beat. We ought to take care of that, don't you think? He motioned toward the vacant balcony. You seem like you could use a respite from everything, so step outside and take a breath with me. I paused, wondering if I was seeing the layers underneath what he was saying. Was I being drawn into something I couldn't resist, or was this just a simple gesture? I was totally unconscious that I had followed Adrian when my gaze strayed to Lucas, who was laughing with friends across the room. The crisp night air outside was a pleasant diversion from Adrian's inner turmoil. You look stunning tonight, he remarked, leaning against the railing, and I followed him, standing near enough to feel his warmth. He spoke in a low, almost personal voice, and I forced a grin, not knowing if I could be trusted. Thank you. There was a heavy silence that felt full of possibilities. As though I was perched on the brink of something monumental that I couldn't undo, yet I stayed put as Adrian's eyes met mine, and for a split second, I believed the intensity in his eyes made the world stop, as if nothing else could stop him from kissing me. Existed before I could respond, his voice was hardly more than a whisper. I believe Lucas knows a froze, you know. Adrian, who is not blind, kept looking into my eyes and saw at the how we're attracted to one another. I gulped hard, my heart pounding. Are you referring to Adrian's tiny head tilt as he studied my question? The question isn't if he knows, but rather, what will you do about it? When my breath caught, everything shifted. Was this a test, a temptation, or something else? As I opened my eyes, I wondered if I was really prepared to step over a boundary I had vowed never to. As I opened my lips to reply, I heard Lucas's voice calling out to me from inside. Hey, sweetie. I was brought back to reality by the sound of his voice, which made my heart race as though it were. Adrian moved away from the railing in an attempt to get away, his smile disappearing into go ahead, something unreadable. He replied quietly, his voice a blend of I'll see you inside, understanding something more I couldn't quite place. I returned inside, but my thoughts were racing, a tornado of uncertainty and doubt about what had transpired, and the reason it felt like the ground below. I felt as though nothing was the same anymore, yet the true query was whether Lucas had been playing his own game the entire time or if he truly understood what was going on. The following week was a haze, and Adrian's remarks from the wedding night kept playing in my head. His touch and the expression in his eyes, so I tried to act as though everything was as usual, but there was a noticeable thickness in the air between Lucas and myself. Suffocating every time I looked into his eyes, as if he could see me. One time, Lucas and I were standing on the precipice of something perilous, and he went right past me as if he knew, leisurely scrolling through the channels while relaxing on the couch when he's mentioned it. "So how was your brief conversation with Adrian the previous evening?" And I froze, my skin tingling with cold sweat, my pulse pounding in my chest. "What do you mean that I was able to stammer?" He shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "The beverages you two were having on the balcony seemed to be quite comfortable for my stomach." Plummeted, he was aware that I was unsure of how or when, but I was certain now that his tone of tranquility and casualness made me feel calm inside. I wondered if this was a test or if I had been wandering into it. Something deeper than I had anticipated, but I just stared at him since I was unable to react right away and didn't know how. Attempting to interpret if he was furious, curious, or unhappy, "But Lucas," he continued, "you know I'm not stupid," with that simple, old smile, as though he were waiting for me to understand. "I noticed how you stared at him." His tone was light, but his eyes were unwavering and keen. He observed everything I did, and I felt a shudder go down my spine when I saw how he stared at you. As I struggled to comprehend the seriousness of what he said, my breath stuck in my throat. "Lucas," I started, unsure of how to handle this new reality. Was he upset? Would he blow up? But Lucas silenced me with a hand gesture rather than his typical outburst. He added, "I'm not angry if that's what you're thinking," in a remarkably quiet voice. Said, "I trust you and I trust him," and he let out a heavy breath, his eyes lingering on me. "But there's something about how things are evolving that doesn't seem worth it. It's so amazing and wonderful that my mind is racing, frantically trying to think of how had I gotten here. Was this just some twisted excitement for him?" I was caught between two males and wasn't sure if I was playing a game or anything else. "You know," Lucas kept talking to him in a contemplative tone, "there is merit to the desire to feel fully alive in the distance. Observe how Adrian looks at you and your response. It's very lovely, in my opinion." Stunned, lovely, I was unable to understand what he was saying or why he was approving of me. His thoughts were racing. Was he supporting this? Softly urging me in Adrian's direction without my knowledge, or was "I'm not asking you to do anything you don't want to do. I'm just overanalyzing things," Lucas said, observing my bewilderment, "but I simply wanted to let you know that I was unable to breathe," and my chest constricted as I felt a wave of terror and bewilderment, believing that I understood Lucas. Understood his limits and his convictions, but now everything felt wrong. What was he of me? And even more horrifyingly, what was it that I was asking myself? Paragraph and silver platter and library trees replaced our intimacy. I knelt between the first falsehoods, which were stacked high up to the station. Keeping them close to me that night while Lucas slept next to me, I discovered I found myself lying awake in the dark, my mind racing with ideas that I was unable to silently. I kept thinking about Adrian and how easily I had fallen. The electrifying connection between us felt as though something more was going on as we entered that area with him. A tension that looked intractable was simmering beneath the surface. Disregard, and then there was Lucas, whose composed manner gave the impression that he was directing everything as though I were a participant in a game he was in charge of. But what did that actually mean? At first, it appeared like Adrian called to ask what he expected from me the next day. Like a casual chat, he was checking in to ask how my week was doing and to share his ideas on the plans for the weekend ahead. He remarked nonchalantly in that light-heartedly taunting tone that made me giggle, but also made me wonder when Lucas would allow me to take you out on a real date. Adrian didn't let it go, despite the awkward moment and the heavy stillness that descended between us. He spoke in a calmer tone, "And I'd been reflecting on what you said the other night about how things are between us." My heart skipped a beat as I inquired, "What are you talking about?" after dancing around it for a while. There was a prolonged pause on the other end of the telephone before my voice became unsteady. "You know what I mean when I say that," he spoke slowly after taking a long breath. "And discuss this matter, the chemistry, the attraction." A surge of my cheeks were flushed with heat, and my heart was racing. This was the moment I had been anticipating, the moment when there was no longer any distinction between right and wrong. How was I to respond? I blurted out, "I'm not sure if we should talk about this." Panic sprang in my chest. Adrian's voice became kind and almost calming as he spoke. "It's just the two of us, and I'm fairly certain you can sense it." His remarks also struck me like a kick to the stomach. Was he correct? Unavoidable, and more significantly, was I prepared to deal with the fallout from entering a situation that, even if my efforts had failed, I couldn't reverse? Didn't matter because the days that followed felt like a gradual, unavoidable countdown to something I was unsure of my ability to stop Adrian's remarks from replaying in my mind. His voice was nearly always there, as if he were challenging me to recognize the implicit conflict between Lucas. Appeared unaware of what had been developing between us all along, but we were pressuring me to acknowledge it. Living his life as if nothing had happened, the game he was playing stayed just out of reach, but I could sense it growing more intense and getting closer every second. On Saturday, when it all finally came to a head at night, Lucas had prepared a peaceful evening for the two of them. I knew Adrian was coming over, so we were lounging and watching movies. Before work, he had texted to ask if he might come over for a quick drink. I initially tried to tell myself it wasn't a huge thing because it was only a casual drink, but when Adrian walked, Lucas welcomed him as though it were just another evening as normal, and I could feel the change in the room as soon as he walked through the door. His smile was different from his usual cheerful, laid-back demeanor, but I couldn't quite place it. I could feel Lucas and Adrian playing their roles in the game. I was the one caught in the center of this twisted little drama. The question that now plagued me was I the one caught between? As the night went on, loyalty and temptation were the ones already caving in to the pull between them both. The tension in the room seemed to increase with each second that went by, yet Lucas seemed at ease, cracking jokes while reclining in his chair, yet I could sense the difference every time our eyes meet. Adrian and I exchanged glances and slight touches. Persisted for an excessive amount of time, which made my skin crawl in the worst possible way. I might have tried to ignore it in order to suppress the emotion and tell myself that everything was all right, but the more I felt like I was drowning in it, the more I tried, and by the time we had had 3 drinks, Adrian got up to leave. He replied nonchalantly, but I could see it in his eyes. I should probably head out. It wasn't yet over, there was still unresolved business between us. Something we both couldn't ignore. His eyes met mine as I could feel the world closing in on me as I stood at the entrance, and I knew what was going to happen next. "Talk to you for a minute," he said in a low voice, as if he were going to disclose something that Lucas was not allowed to know. The other room, totally oblivious to what was happening just in front of me, the guilt struck me like a breathless as the tidal wave crashed over me, yet beneath it was something more sinister, an adrenaline rush of peril. Adrian wasn't being subtle anymore, he was risking everything, and I stood in fear. Unable to talk, my mind racing in 1,000 directions. Instructions: Mark is in the other room and is unsure of how I could accomplish this. But then the heat of Adrian's presence drew me in beneath the guilt. Adrian muttered, "I can't stop thinking about you," stronger than I wanted to admit. "I need to know how you feel," because his voice is so faint that it sends chills down my spine. "The same way, or am I squandering my time?" My heart was racing. My chest, and I wondered, is this happening? The words didn't seem real. Of Lucas sitting a few feet away, utterly oblivious to the overwhelming weight of everything me, but underneath it was another object with a nearly electric charge. Adrian shook his head. "I don't know," I stammered, trying to find my voice. "His eyes are burning intensely, and his head is slowly moving. Is this wrong? Just what we're meant to think and what is expected of us by everyone." Felt as though the entire world was inverted when it reached out and touched mine. Stepped back, jerking my hand away, my heart pounding with need and terror. "We can't do this," I muttered, scarcely raising my voice beyond a breath, "not in this manner." But when I was speaking, I wasn't sure if there was a draw, an irresistible allure that was getting stronger every second. Was I going to leave it? Could I? The living room door creaked open as I was starting to think about it. Luck stood there, his presence weighing down the room like a burden. The face was unreadable, but for a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of dismay, laughter, or anything else concealed in his eyes. Everything was well. As though attempting to comfort, Lucas asked in a steady, even unsettling voice. I told him that everything was good, but I could sense the tension beneath it, so I turned to face him and felt guilty. Oh, yes, I was just speaking, and I shook my voice. Lucas nodded, but his eyes lingered on Adrian before he added, I think we should head to bed early. He turned his back and headed back into the kitchen tomorrow without waiting for an answer. It was left standing there in the room, weighed down by what seemed to me like a silent dismissal. Tension between two universes. Adrian gave me one more glance before walked out the door, and as soon as he did, I was overcome with regret. Left the house in a deafening quiet. Was this the end of it, or had, when the door closed behind him, I sensed that something irrevocable had already begun? Imprisoned as though I were in a fight that nobody could witness, but that everyone would soon, even though Lucas hadn't spoken, I could sense it. Knowing that he had to, he went back to the living room and took a seat by me. On the focused look in his eyes as he read me on the couch caused my for the first time in our marriage, I felt vulnerable and could see my heart beating more quickly. What would you like to do now, Lucas, when I've taken down every barrier I put up around myself? The question hung in the air as he spoke softly and meaningfully. Unresolved, my throat constricted, preventing me from responding to him. How could I respond? The truth was that I was unable to reverse the actions that had already been taken. The most terrifying thing was that I wasn't sure I wanted to do anything at all. Changed, and I felt frightened.